want to welcome you all to Snow, Floods, and Fires, Oh My, a Case for Regional Transportation Resilience with Suseel Indrakanti of Cambridge Systematics. Winter storms, spring flooding, and summer wildfires can wreak havoc on our transportation system. The resulting impacts can range from mere inconveniences to being deadly. This evening, we'll explore why proactively planning for a resilient transportation system is key to minimizing the impacts and disruptions caused by extreme weather and natural hazards, and how we can make our transportation system more resilient when severe weather hits, like last night. Suseel is the practice lead for resilience and sustainability at Cambridge Systematics, with over 17 years of experience in climate risk and resilience assessments, transportation planning, and climate mitigation and adaptation. His experience supporting local, state, national, and international clients in the area of transportation system resilience. Suseel is leading several national cooperative highway research projects on risk and resilience, and has led multiple projects focusing on impacts of severe weather on transportation planning and policy. And the kicker, he is a proud alumnus of Boise State University with a master's in civil engineering. Welcome back to the Treasure Valley.
Thanks, Mike.
You can find Suseel's full bio on the table by the door. Soft drinks and refreshments are in the back by the door. Restrooms are out the back to your right and then on your right. If you did not sign in, please do so before you leave. Sign-in forms are on the table by the door. Evaluation forms are on your tables. Please fill one out tonight before you leave and leave it in the basket on the table by the door. We will be taping tonight's presentation and share it later on Compass's YouTube channel. We'll also share Suseel's slides on Compass's website. You can find flyers for future education series presentations on the table in the back. Now, to avoid the awkward moment, please silence your cell phones and join me in welcoming Suseel. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks to all the Compass staff for inviting me here to talk about transportation resilience. Really happy to be back after 16 years, after completing my master's here, and seeing a complete change in landscape in Boise. And Amy was just walking me through all the changes and showing them to me on our drive here and all over the place. So it's just fantastic to see so much growth in Boise, and good to be back. Again, as Matt mentioned, I'm with Cambridge Systematics. We are a transportation consulting firm headquartered in Boston. We just had our 50-year anniversary since our inception. We offer everything from policy, planning, modeling, and software tools as they relate to transportation. And we have around 200 folks working in 12 different offices across the country. I lead a practice called Resilience and Sustainability that addresses everything on the adaptation side, but also the mitigation side, which gets at greenhouse gas emission reductions and the overall sustainability, which is a very big umbrella. You can see a QR code to our practice area, things that we are doing and all of that, so I just included it for your use. So for this evening, I wanted to spend some time on the basics of risk and resilience, everything from how you define some of these terms, how do you assess risk and resilience. Let's talk assets and hazards as they relate to transportation, because many of the agencies that we encounter in our day-to-day jobs are owners and operators of transportation infrastructure, and also providers of transportation as a service to communities. I'll give you some examples of how risk and resilience have been assessed around the country, and more so in a context after the bipartisan infrastructure law, which has some recommendations on conducting some of these assessments, and we'll go into some of those details. And we'll spend a little bit of time with all that information on assessing risk and resilience. How do you then integrate it into a regional planning context? And that's where I think it's a good discussion to be had, given Compass's role in shaping the Treasure Valley's future and those of the residents of the area. We'll do some quick recap and Q&A, leave some time for questions, discussions, and all of that. As far as the objectives, I usually have this slide at the very outset so that we can look through what we are going to learn or discuss over the next 30 to 45 minutes and come back to this very slide at the end and see if we have had a chance to hit off all these topics. So those would be a quick orientation to transportation resilience, getting to the basics, as we talked about, a good understanding of hazards and their potential impacts on transportation systems and infrastructure. We'll look at some shared living experiences and needs, and this is where we get into some of the resilience needs and get into adaptation strategies. So what do you do once you have assessed risk and resilience? And then how does it all integrate into what Compass does, or like a transportation agency does on a day-to-day basis? So quickly, we'll go through some basics, but I want to start with some Menti questions. So if you can get your phones or laptops out and sign into menti.com and use the code, or you can just use the QR code. We'll have some questions that we'd really like your responses on throughout the presentation, so that we are getting some feedback from you as the public from the region in terms of your experiences, your lived experiences, known areas of concern, and so on and so forth. We have 10 responses: minimizing disruption, being prepared, adaptability, bouncing back, weather, strong, adaptability. Some really good ways to characterize resilience. So when we
Oh my God. Oh my.
When we hear about climate impacts and impacts due to extreme weather around the US, there are areas where these disruptions take on an apocalyptic proportion. So some examples you see on the screen. The top left is Houston, Interstate 45 inundated during Hurricane Harvey. To the top right, you see the Nebraska floods from 2019, where they had some major flooding impacts, which led to agricultural losses and all of that, and the 2020 wildfires in California at the bottom. There are disruptions that this area has seen as well, not in those proportions, but certainly that impacts transportation, mobility, and infrastructure as well. So as you can see, a couple of shots from downtown flooding just in June last year. And you also see some Interstate 84 disruptions. So these are between Mountain Home and Boise.
What was that about? In March 2024, was it in Boise and Mountain Home?
Yeah, so this was
Is that snow?
snow, yes.
Oh, okay.
Loss of physics always apply.
So quick overview of some definitions, and these square very well with some of the words that you have used to characterize resilience. Anticipation, preparing for, adapting, withstand, respond to, and recover rapidly from disruptions. So as you can see, they span the whole pre-disaster when you are preparing for some of these events to happen, during and after. So when the event is happening itself, and after that, during recovery and all of that. So risk is another term that is used, and it's being used more and more. Living with risk, managing risk when it comes to managing infrastructure. So risk is the positive or negative effects of uncertainty and variability. So this is right out of the code itself. And many of the asset management plans that DOTs and transportation agencies are preparing have to incorporate risk now into their decision making at various different levels, both enterprise, programmatic, as well as individual asset level risk. So I mentioned about the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and that post that there has been some guidance that was put out as part of the Protect program, which is a new program, and there is guidance in there which incorporates the use of risk when conducting vulnerability assessments, which are now called risk-informed vulnerability assessments. So we'll get into some of the language in the next several slides, but wanted to highlight that as to why we are talking about risk at this stage. So how do we assess risk and resilience, and why is it important, right? So understanding and identification of these areas of vulnerability and risk are the first step to then recognizing where these areas of concern exist. What is the likelihood of such an event happening? What is the consequence if that event happens? And then what do we need to do to either mitigate that risk, manage it, or eventually even live with it in some communities? I know it's hard to see this at this scale, but there are several of these frameworks that exist for assessing risk and resilience, and one of the several ones that have been developed are Federal Highways Vulnerability Adaptation Framework. Then there is the RAMCAP framework that the mechanical side of the world gave us. And what you see on the screen to the right is the framework that is now being used by the AASHTO Risk and Resilience Manual to provide a consistent guidance for all states and transportation agencies to undertake risk and resilience assessments. On the left, you see a framework that we at Chem Systematics developed for developing these resilience improvement plans, which are encouraged by states and MPOs now as part of the Protect guidance. And so both of them actually combine aspects of frameworks that have existed before, and the one on the left is specifically developed for undertaking resilience improvement plans. So in common language, these are more like you can call them roadmaps to conducting risk and resilience assessments, and they have these 4 broad buckets, which will outline some of what we'll go through in our discussion over the next several slides. The first one is defining what resilience means to the agency and the community. Objectives, what do you want to get out of the resilience plan? Why are you doing it? What are your motivations? Some of them might be financial, some of them might be regulatory, and some of them might actually be in quest for good planning and best practice in terms of incorporating an uncertainty as well as impacts of climate variability and extreme weather into planning. And then follow these questions. What are the hazards that we have to look into? What are consequential to the region? What affect us? What are going to be affecting us in the future? So it's not just what has happened until now, but also what is projected to happen in the future. So we'll talk a little bit about sources for that information. Again, in the next several slides. But I also want to get into what assets, right? So when you talk assets, it also is a question about what is important to you. And we'll get into some of those characterization questions in a little bit. But that is where you ask, is it roadways? You want to include transit routes, bridges, and all these sorts of questions, and how expansive do you want it to be? And we'll get into some of those tiering questions and other things through several examples. And then once we have conducted an assessment, we'll then look into identifying the resilience needs. So once you have your problem areas, now the question is what are we prepared to do about it? What are the options that we have? Where do we need to improve? What kind of improvement should it be? And all of that. And finally, all this good information that you have developed through a resilience plan needs to be integrated into your planning framework. And we'll have the last part of this presentation talk a little bit about how that fits in contextually. So we have a second question in terms of why is planning for resilience important for you as residents of Treasure Valley? I'll start. Financial responsibility is a good one. So for on the growth side of things, can the person who entered that information speak to it a little bit? Yes.
So support more people in the valley. Anything that happens is just going to have a greater impact because we have more people here who are going to be trying to get around, do different things. And so it's just going to be all that more critical that we're ready for.
I like the use of the word critical there. So how do you make sure that goods and services flow despite some of the disruptions? There are some very good case studies on staging locations that have been switched around from Texas and Florida while hurricanes are hitting Texas. They have changed the staging locations to Florida and like vice versa, and they kept operations open, and they were able to pull off like very little, with very little in terms of disruptions. So these are some really good responses.
Put those $3 signs on. Thank you.
Oh,
wanted to see if I could use it.
All right. So let's talk assets and hazards. We talked about assets in terms of like which ones do you want to consider in your assessment. Many areas, it's mostly your roadways, bridges, other assets of regional or statewide significance. And here is where you have to balance as an agency and also as a community service provider in terms of what assets are important to you as an agency, as owners, operators, or planners of a region, but also what services are important to your residents in terms of including them for resiliency purposes. So this is an example from Ulster County where we have tiered some of these assets in terms.
I have been there.
In terms of their importance from a regional significance standpoint, so if the disruption will cause a regional impact, think about a higher level function class facility, for example, like I-84 or one of the major highways in the region. So that would be considered a tier 1 facility, for example. Bridges, perhaps even bus routes. So in this particular example, we did a full-on vulnerability assessment for these tier 1, so-called tier 1 facilities, which have consequences if they are disrupted due to any event. Tier 2 ones are, again, we talked a little bit about this when we had our internal conversation. So these are specific to Ulster County, New York, but if you are doing it here, for example, dams would probably be in the tier 1 due to the fact that Lucky Peak Reservoir is one of the major pieces of infrastructure which can have a significant impact on flooding in the region. And you can see that there are different tier 2 facilities, for example, trails, stormwater units, and all of those whose disruption might not actually cause a consequence that is regionally significant. So those are some of the ways in which you would characterize your assets in different tiers. We also include essential facilities, and this is one of those best practice things that we do because we don't always look at infrastructure as being there because we own it or we operate it, but also as a service to reach critical destinations. For example, hospitals, fire stations, and all of those facilities as well. So those would be incorporated into how important a facility is in terms of providing access to those critical destinations. Here is an example of hazards that have been considered in Indianapolis in their recent resiliency snapshot. So you can see that this is actually from the state hazard mitigation plan, and you can see the highlighted areas, Ada and Canyon County, and you will see that the H marks hazards that have been assessed as high hazard. So this is based on a rating. But you will see that severe storms and earthquake are rated higher. And there are drought, extreme, so flood, landslide, earthquake, and seismic, and wildfire and volcano ash. That one I had to look it up because volcano ash seems to be the one that was highlighted in the Ada County plan, and it wasn't part of the Canyon County one. So I quickly wanted to show a couple of snapshots from the Havoc County local hazard mitigation plan. Just as an example, so what you see on the screen, so the left screenshot is a FEMA flood hazard map with 100 and 500 year floodplain information. And the one on the right, which tracks pretty closely, is the Lucky Peak Dam failure inundation area. So that denotes the area which will be flooded if the dam fails.
We don't want
And as you can see to the left, so these are all hazards that have been listed in the local hazard mitigation plan. So if you are looking for a starting point to pick your hazards, this would be the list. So there are some really good resources here. Austin was just mentioning this in our podcast a little while ago, the Hazard and Climate Resilience Institute, HCRI, out of Boise State. So they have a wealth of resources on regional hazards, both in terms of what the impacts are going to be for some of those hazards, but also the past events and also what is projected in the future as well. So they have information on how to prepare, local resources, and all of that. And again, most importantly, how is a changing climate going to impact the region as part of the hazard? So I want to move on to the asset characterization, which is one of the ways, and as a consultant, this is the place where early on in the project, I'm always a little nervous because most clients, they start with, I want to assess everything. To me, all transportation infrastructure needs to be assessed, right? So then comes the conversation about, okay, so how are those important to you from a regional mobility standpoint? Do you really have the resources to assess all of those? And then, would you really invest in every last one of those assets if they are disrupted? And the price tag for adaptation options, when you come up with a list at the end of the day, is going to be huge. And you have to prioritize. And the prioritization part, until that part happens, you're always on pins and needles in terms of like whittling this list down to something that is manageable and also something that provides value to the agency which is conducting it. So these are different ways of characterizing assets based on their usage, their designation, operational importance. So these are all things that have to do with the traffic that they are carrying, their designation, are the interstate, are the local roads, are the evacuation routes. Do they have significance in terms of providing that ingress-egress when there are events like this happening? So these are all things that can be taken into consideration from an operational and usage standpoint. And then there are the socioeconomic ones, which get at what are the communities that you are serving in terms of their importance. Are they employment centers? Are they huge population centers? Are they rural areas? Are there areas where your equity populations live? So those are all considerations from a socioeconomic standpoint. And the third one is more from that activity centers that we talked about and how the assets that you have selected are providing access to those critical destinations. So here is where you get to select, please.
What's the significance of the numerical digit by each one?
Yes, I will.
Okay.
So This is an example from one of the northeastern states, which will remain nameless for now because it's still in draft. But in parentheses is the weightage that we have given to each of them. So you can weight those three categories equally, or you can say usage and operations is very important to me. So I'll give 50% of the total weight to that and 25 each to socioeconomic and health and safety. And you can go at it that way. I know it's a little hard to read, but this is one of such examples which provides a weighting scheme. Not exactly what you saw in the earlier slide, but gives you a sense of how you can score based on functional class, for example, population density, whether it's an equity area, whether the asset provides mode redundancy, is it a transit corridor? So in that sense, should it be prioritized for recovery ahead of the other assets? So these are all things that would go into a construct that will give a relative way to assess how important these assets are. So this is like an overarching slide that that gives us a good overview of a construct of what goes into assessing risk. So these are all terms that we can get into in the next several slides, but I wanted to show that risk, what you see on the left, is a product of consequence, which is what happens when the disruption happens, what are the costs of something like that happening. The vulnerability of the asset, which is, again, a construct of three different things: exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. I'll get into some of these things, but wanted to provide you with the building blocks that go into assessing risk. Again, exposure, so vulnerability is a function of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. So exposure, as in whether the asset is within a floodplain, for example, or whether it is exposed to wildfire risk, or some sort of other flood risk. So those are all examples. And in some cases, there is also the gradation where you would prioritize, for example, the depth of flood as an indicator. You would have different levels of exposure for just overtopping versus 3 feet of flood or something like that. So there are different ways to prioritize all this information. Sensitivity is the asset's own condition. So if it is in a bad condition to begin with, if a bridge is either structurally deficient or functionally obsolete, the impact due to a hazard will have a greater impact on the ability for the bridge to take that impact. Adaptive capacity is the way in which the asset can cope with the impact. So examples include, so if you have, for example, a redundant roadway system. So for example, if you are in a more dense urban environment, even if one of your segments is impacted, you still have a way to get around it. But if it is a lifeline asset and that is your only way in and out, then you don't have much adaptive capacity. If that link goes down, the community's access goes down completely. So those are different ways in which adaptive capacity is included. as part of this. So again, there are several different sample indicators which get into all of this. This is one of the examples. We talked about risk. So once we have assessed vulnerability, then comes the question. Yes, it is vulnerable to flooding, but how frequently does the flooding happen? Is it once in a, is it happening every year? What is the return period like? Is it a 100-year flood event? Is it a 500-year flood event? So the probability of that event happening is something that is very important in taking consideration.
Well, here's the loaded question.
Yep.
Given that there has been changes in the climate and the weather in certain areas, how do you get how does the probability change on those things?
That's a very good question. The probability of those events which were initially 100 years are much shorter now. So, and there are new tools coming online which account for that change in probabilities as well. But again, they are models, and those models have an uncertainty attached to them. So when we are explaining how those work, we have to explain a little bit about how uncertainty plays into that. So you're not dealing in absolutes in a more deterministic manner, but in ranges. And then there are the consequences, right? So once the event happens, so what are the costs associated with it? So costs to who is the next question? To a community, to users, or the owners and operators. So those are all things that go into the consequence. So that is how the construct of risk comes about. And then this is one of the ways in which prioritization happens. So your high risk, high criticality assets, just based on the need and also their importance, are ranked higher. And this is one of the examples in which we have organized the results of the assessment and provided them with the top X number of facilities which rank high in risk and criticality. So briefly wanted to talk about resilience for a bit in terms of how it is measured. And there is a very good construct that gets at, so these are called the 4 R's of resilience. And these go back to the definition that we just discussed a little bit earlier. So the ability to withstand is robustness. Redundancy, we talked about availability of a different mode or availability of additional ways to get around. That would be detours, other things. Resourcefulness, and this is where an agency who is either the owner, operator, or provider of service brings additional resources to bear in terms of being able to prioritize when an asset goes down or disrupted. And then the rapidity part, how quickly is the asset being restored to full functionality. So we as resilience planners are all working to minimize that red triangle. And I give an example of a flat tire analogy, and this is easy to understand in terms of what the 4 R's mean. And we all have had car issues in terms of like having a flat tire. So robustness in this case would be having a run flat tire or having the tires in good condition to begin with, or puncture resistant tires. Redundancy, for example, would be having a spare tire or having a spare vehicle. Resourcefulness, access to towing, and perhaps even an inflator to take that to the job. And rapidity, right? So being able to schedule and get to a repair shop. And we have all been in a situation where the flat happens after your traditional hours, and we are screwed till the morning. So it's all, again, a function of time, and as you can see, rapidity is that function of time. So with all this said, wanted to quickly spend a quick moment on areas that, from your lived experience, you can relate to that are impacted by some of these stressors. So the example, so you can provide some examples as in cross streets or this particular area, downtown Boise or things like that. So if you can provide any information, specific locations would be great. So again, these are from your lived experiences and recent past. So things that you have noticed that you have seen impacted by hazards. Green belt flooding. What is the I-84 example for, or case for?
Ice.
Ice, okay. Green belt keeps coming up more and more. We're just crossing the river.
Yeah, close.
Right? Are we still? Right. Snow on neighborhood streets. Lack of storm drains. That's a major issue that is being dealt with from a stormwater standpoint. Water mains bursting. Road to my call. Awesome. All right, so when those events happen, what are some of the basic needs that are impacted and due to these disruptions? So what can't you do due to those disruptions? And what are the services that are being hampered? What errands would you run, and would you not be able to run during those disruptions? So the idea here is to prioritize your mobility needs, especially under disruptions. So that is why we are trying to ask this question. Military functions, evacuations, access to schools. Tourist spots. That's a good one. Medical care. All right. So, quickly wanted to end with how all this information, so once you have assessed your risk and resilience, once you have looked at your problem spots, assessed where your vulnerabilities are, where you have a high risk of disruption, how is that information incorporated into regional planning, for example? So several different ways where it can be plugged in. So one is project screening and prioritization. So if resilience is included as a planning factor, which is now a requirement post FAST Act, so that is one of the ways. Then there is the scenario planning in terms of models that you can run, in terms of how both demographics and infrastructure are going to evolve in the region over the next 20 or more years. And then eventually using that information and making changes to project design and development. And examples on this include, for example, examples of building in floodplains. What would you change? Are there ordinances or pre-existing laws or mandates that cover that? Or should they be designed to new standards given changes in probabilities and all of that? So this is a good example which puts the whole issue of resilience when it comes to project prioritization in context. So this is an example of Boston MBO's evaluation of their major projects, and the highlighted area in red is one of several factors that determines the priorities for resilience in the grand context of, for example, economic competitiveness, mobility, other things as well. So just think of this as one more thing that goes into project prioritization when, yeah, so really quickly wanted to cover that we had a quick orientation to transportation resilience. We discussed hazards and potential impacts. Got some information from you on needs, locations, and again, finally ending with how does it all integrate into regional planning.